Montana Territory, 1885. The wagon rattled over the rutted trail toward Pine Ridge, its wooden wheels crunching against the gravel path with a sound like brittle laughter. Inside, wrapped in a threadbare traveling coat, sat a woman who hadn't smiled in nearly a year. Her eyes, fixed on the distant mountains, held the emptiness of someone who had forgotten how joy felt. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Winters clutched her small carpetbag to her chest, her knuckles white with tension. The simple brown dress she wore had once been her Sunday best, now faded from washing and travel. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a severe style that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, once considered pretty, now drawn and solemn. Most noticeable was the downward turn of her mouth, set in a permanent line as if happiness had become a foreign language she no longer remembered how to speak. "Pine Ridge Station." "End of the line, miss," called the driver, his voice cutting through Rebecca's thoughts. The other passengers, a young couple and an older gentleman, gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark. Rebecca remained motionless, her gaze still fixed on some distant point. Only when the wagon had emptied did she slowly rise, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she might shatter with any sudden motion. Pine Ridge was smaller than she had imagined from the descriptions in the letters. A cluster of wooden buildings lined the single dirt road, a general store with peeling paint, a small church with a weathered cross, a saloon that seemed to be doing the most business, and scattered houses that appeared to lean against the wind. Beyond the modest settlement, pine-covered mountains rose majestically against the vast Montana sky, indifferent to the tiny human concerns below. Rebecca stepped down from the wagon, her legs stiff from the 2-day journey from Helena. The late September air carried a chill that promised an early winter. She adjusted her worn shawl, suddenly aware of how unprepared she was for the mountain weather. In her bag was a letter, creased from repeated reading, from Sheriff Thomas Calloway, a widower seeking a wife to help care for his 10-year-old daughter. Rebecca had answered his advertisement in the Matrimonial Times 3 months ago, after her life in Boston had collapsed around her. She had told him she was hardworking, educated, and good with children. She had not mentioned that smiling had become impossible, that laughter had died in her throat the day everything she believed in had been destroyed. "Miss Winters?" Rebecca turned toward the voice. A man approached from the direction of the sheriff's office. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes the color of faded denim. His brown hair was flecked with silver at the temples, and he wore a simple black coat over a clean white shirt. The silver star pinned to his vest caught the afternoon sunlight. Rebecca nodded in acknowledgement. "I'm Sheriff Thomas Calloway," he said, removing his hat. "I apologize for not meeting you at the scheduled time. There was a dispute at the Mercantile that needed attention." Rebecca nodded again, her face remaining impassive. Up close, Thomas Calloway looked older than she had imagined from his letters, perhaps in his late 30s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and worry. His face was tanned from outdoor work, his hands strong and capable. "Let me take that for you," he offered, gesturing to her bag. Rebecca shook her head, clutching the carpetbag closer. It contained everything she owned in the world: 2 dresses, undergarments, a hairbrush, her father's pocket watch, and a small box that held the remnants of her previous life. Things she couldn't bear to leave behind, but couldn't bear to look at either. If Thomas was offended by her refusal, he didn't show it. "The wagon's this way," he said, gesturing toward a modest buckboard, hitched to a patient-looking bay horse. "It's about a 30-minute ride to my place. The road's rough in spots, but Copper here knows every rut and hole." As they walked toward the wagon, Rebecca felt the stares of the townspeople. A mail-order bride was nothing unusual in these parts, but her severe appearance and complete lack of expression clearly drew attention. She kept her eyes fixed ahead, ignoring the whispers that followed them. Thomas helped her onto the wagon seat, careful not to touch her more than necessary, then climbed up beside her. "Emma, my daughter, she's been looking forward to meeting you," he said as they pulled away from the station. "She's been baking all morning. I had to practically order her to stop before we ran out of flour." Rebecca didn't respond, but Thomas didn't seem to expect it. He continued talking as they drove through the small town and out toward the foothills. He pointed out landmarks: the schoolhouse where Emma attended, the creek that ran behind his property, the hills where deer came down to drink at dawn. Rebecca listened silently, observing the land around them. Montana was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that was nothing like the prim streets of Boston. The mountains dominated everything, making human concerns seem small and temporary. There was something comforting in that vastness, that indifference. "You've come a long way," Thomas said eventually. "Boston to Montana isn't an easy journey." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca glanced at him, surprised he remembered where she was from. His letters had been thoughtful but practical, focused more on arrangements than personal details. "I imagine it's very different from what you're used to." "Oh," he continued, "winters are harsh here, but spring makes up for it. The whole valley turns green almost overnight, and wildflowers cover the hillsides. It's something to see." His voice held a quiet pride in his home, a genuine love for this rugged country. Rebecca found herself wondering what it would be like to feel that kind of attachment to a place again. "There it is," Thomas said after they had traveled for some time in comfortable silence. "Home." The Calloway house appeared around a bend in the road, a two-story farmhouse with a wide front porch and blue shutters. It was larger than Rebecca had expected, well-maintained and solid-looking. A barn stood nearby, along with a corral and several outbuildings. Smoke rose from the chimney, and flowers still bloomed in boxes beneath the windows, adding spots of color to the weathered wood. As they pulled into the yard, the front door burst open, and a small figure ran out. Emma Calloway was a sprite of a girl with her father's blue eyes and light brown hair that escaped from her braids in wispy curls. She wore a blue dress with an apron that bore evidence of her baking endeavors. "You're here," she called, bouncing on her toes as the wagon came to a stop. "Papa, you're late. I thought maybe you forgot." "Sheriff business, sweetheart," Thomas explained as he climbed down. "Miss Winters, this is my daughter Emma." Emma approached the wagon, her expression a mixture of curiosity and hope. "Hello, Miss Winters. I'm so happy you've come. I made apple tarts for you because Papa said you were coming from very far away, and traveling makes people hungry." Rebecca managed a small nod as Thomas helped her down from the wagon. Emma's enthusiasm was like a bright flame, almost painful to be near when one's own light had gone out. "Come inside," Emma said, reaching for Rebecca's hand, then thinking better of it. "I'll show you your room. Papa fixed it up special. He put up new curtains and everything, though he had to ask Mrs. Peterson from the Mercantile what color a lady would like." Inside, the house was surprisingly welcoming. The main room held a stone fireplace where a small fire crackled, a dining table that could seat 6, and several comfortable-looking chairs arranged near the hearth. Everything was clean and orderly, though distinctly masculine in its simplicity. "Emma," Thomas said gently, "why don't you show Miss Winters to her room so she can rest before supper? It's been a long journey." "Of course," Emma said, leading the way up a narrow staircase. "You must be tired." When Papa had to go to Helena for the territorial council meeting, he said the journey nearly wore him down to his boot soles. The guest room was small but pleasant, with a window that overlooked the mountains and a bed covered with a colorful quilt. Someone, Emma, most likely had placed wildflowers in a mason jar on the dresser. "The quilt was my mother's," Emma said, her voice softening. She made it the winter before she died. Papa said you might like to use it, but if you don't want to, there are others in the trunk. Rebecca touched the quilt gently, running her fingers over the careful stitches. A labor of love from a woman she would never meet, whose place she was meant to fill. Supper's at 6, Emma continued. Papa made stew because it's getting cold at night now. He's a good cook, though sometimes he forgets things are done and leaves them on the stove too long. I try to remind him, but I forget too. Rebecca sat her bag on the bed and removed her shawl, aware that Emma was watching her closely. Miss Winters, Emma said hesitantly, Papa said you might be tired from your journey and not want to talk much at first. That's all right. Sometimes when I'm sad or tired, I don't feel like talking either. But I'm a good listener if you ever want to tell stories or just talk about your day. The simple kindness in the child's words made Rebecca's throat tighten. She nodded, hoping Emma would understand her gratitude. I'll let you rest now, Emma said, backing toward the door. Just come down when you're ready. Left alone, Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. The journey had been long, but it wasn't just physical weariness that dragged. At her, it was the effort of beginning again, of trying to build something new from the ashes of her old life. She unpacked her meager belongings, hanging her spare dress in the small wardrobe and placing her undergarments in a drawer. Her father's pocket watch she set carefully on the bedside table. The small wooden box remained in her bag. She wasn't ready to look at its contents yet. Through the window, she could see Thomas in the yard, unhitching the horse and leading it toward the barn. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his surroundings. His letters had been straightforward about what he was offering a home: security, companionship, help with Emma. No mention of love or romance, just practical partnership. It was exactly what Rebecca had been looking for. Emotions had proven dangerous. Practicality seemed safer. A sharp knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Miss Winters? Thomas's voice came through the wood. May I speak with you a moment? Rebecca opened the door, finding Thomas standing in the hallway, hat in hand. I just wanted to make sure you're settling in all right, he said. I know this is a big change. Rebecca nodded, her face carefully neutral. I want you to know, Thomas continued, that I understand this arrangement is unusual. I don't expect anything beyond what we discussed in our letters. You'll have time to adjust, to get to know Emma and me before any decisions are made about the future. Relief flooded through Rebecca. Despite their agreement, she had feared he might expect immediate intimacy, might want to claim his rights as her potential husband right away. His consideration was unexpected and deeply appreciated. Emma's very excited to have you here, Thomas said, a smile softening his weathered face. She's been without a mother for 4 years now. I've done my best, but there are things a growing girl needs that I can't provide. Rebecca nodded again, trying to convey understanding without words. Well, Thomas said, seeming to sense her fatigue, I'll let you rest. Supper in about an hour, but no rush if you're too tired. We can always set a plate aside for later. After he left, Rebecca sat by the window, watching the sun begin its descent behind the mountains. The view was spectacular, jagged peaks, painted gold and purple in the fading light. The valley below already shadowed with approaching night. So different from Boston's crowded streets and sea-scented air. Had it only been 4 months since her world collapsed? Since James Harrington, her fiancé of 2 years, had revealed himself to be not the respected businessman she believed, but a fraud who had swindled dozens of people, including her father, out of their life savings. 4 months she had stood in the courthouse, watching as the man she had loved was sentenced to prison, his charming smile never wavering as he winked at her on his way out. The scandal had destroyed her family. Her father, unable to bear the shame and financial ruin, had suffered a fatal heart attack 2 weeks later. The house and belongings had been sold to pay creditors. Her friends had vanished. unwilling to associate with the woman foolish enough to be deceived by Boston's most notorious confidence man. But worst of all had been the whispers, the speculation. Had she known? Had she been part of it? How could she not have suspected? The questions had followed her everywhere, each one a fresh cut to her already wounded heart. The last straw had come when Mrs. Harrington, James's mother and one of Boston's social leaders, had confronted her after church. "You brought this on yourself," the woman had hissed. A truly proper young woman would have seen through him. "Your inferior breeding shows in your gullibility." That night, Rebecca had seen the advertisement in the newspaper she was using to line her trunk. "Sheriff in Montana Territory seeks bride. Must be of good character, educated, and kind to children. No fortune required, only honest heart." She had written that very night, her letter deliberately understated, making no mention of the scandal or her broken heart. She had described herself as a teacher's daughter with some education and experience with children. When Thomas Calloway had responded, his letter warm but practical, Rebecca had seen it as her only escape. Now, sitting in this quiet room with the Montana sunset painting the sky, Rebecca wondered if she had made the right choice. Could she truly start over? Could she be what Thomas and Emma needed when she felt so hollow inside? She touched her face, feeling the stiff muscles around her mouth. When had she last smiled? Not since before the trial, she was certain. It wasn't a conscious decision, but somewhere along the way, her face had forgotten how to form the expression, just as her heart had forgotten how to feel joy. A delicious smell wafted up from downstairs, accompanied by the sound of Emma's voice chattering and the deeper tones of Thomas responding. An ordinary moment in an ordinary day for them. Could such ordinary moments become hers too? Rebecca smoothed her travel-wrinkled dress as best she could and pinned back a few stray hairs that had escaped during the journey. She couldn't offer much to this small family, not wealth, not beauty, not even a smile, but she could offer presence. It would have to be enough for now. Downstairs, the kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of beef stew and fresh bread. Emma was setting the table while Thomas stood at the stove, stirring a large pot. "Miss Winters," Emma said, noticing her first. "You're just in time. Papa's stew is ready, and I made the bread all by myself, though Papa had to help with the oven part." "Perfect timing," Thomas agreed with a nod. "Please have a seat." The meal was simple but delicious rich stew, with tender beef and vegetables, crusty bread still warm from the oven, and apple tarts that Emma proudly served for dessert. Throughout the meal, Emma kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling Rebecca about her school, her friends, and her cat, Whiskers, who was currently hunting mice in the barn. Thomas occasionally added comments or gently redirected Emma when her chatter became too overwhelming, but mostly he let his daughter carry the conversation. Rebecca noticed how he watched Emma with undisguised love, how his stern sheriff's face softened whenever she laughed. "Miss Winters," Emma said as they finished the tarts, "do you like to read? Papa got me Treasure Island for my birthday, but some of the words are too big. Maybe you could help me with them sometime?" Rebecca nodded, and Emma's face lit up. "Papa has lots of books," she continued excitedly. "He reads every night before bed. Sometimes he reads to me too, but he doesn't do the voices right. Can you do voices when you read?" Rebecca hesitated, then gave another small nod, though she wasn't sure if she remembered how to make her voice anything but flat. "Emma," Thomas said gently, "Miss Winters has had a long journey. Let's not overwhelm her with questions her first night." "Sorry, Papa," Emma said, looking contrite for a moment before brightening again. "But it's just so exciting to have someone new here, especially someone who might be my new mother." Rebecca felt her chest tighten at the hopeful expression on Emma's face. This child wanted so desperately to have a mother, and Rebecca wasn't sure she had anything left to give. Not happiness, not warmth, not the love a child deserved. That's enough, Emma, Thomas said firmly. Remember what we discussed. Miss Winters is our guest. Whatever happens beyond that is something we'll all decide together when the time is right. Emma nodded, but her eyes still shone with hope when she looked at Rebecca. It was almost painful to see such naked longing. After supper, Thomas insisted that Rebecca sit while he and Emma cleared the table. You're still recovering from your journey, he said. There will be plenty of time for chores later. Rebecca watched as father and daughter worked together with the easy rhythm of a long-established routine. Emma washed the dishes while Thomas dried them, the two talking quietly about Emma's upcoming spelling test, and whether the old hound dog that had been hanging around the barn might make a good hunting companion. Later, as Thomas lit lamps against the gathering darkness, a knock came at the door. Rebecca tensed, not ready to meet more strangers. Thomas opened the door to reveal a young man in a deputy's uniform. "Evening, Sheriff," the deputy said, tipping his hat. "Sorry to bother you at home, but there's trouble at the saloon. Miller and Jackson are at it again over that boundary dispute." Thomas sighed. "I'll be right there, Deputy Evans." He turned to Rebecca and Emma. "I'm sorry, but I need to handle this. Official business." "It's all right, Papa," Emma said. "I can show Miss Winters where everything is." "I shouldn't be too long," Thomas said, reaching for his hat and gun belt. "Deputy Evans, this is Miss Rebecca Winters, recently arrived from Boston. Miss Winters, Deputy Michael Evans." The young deputy tipped his hat, his curious gaze taking in Rebecca's solemn face. "Ma'am, pleasure to meet you. Welcome to Pine Ridge." Rebecca acknowledged him with a slight nod. After Thomas left, Emma showed Rebecca around the rest of the house, the small study where Thomas kept his books and did paperwork, the back porch that caught the morning sun, the root cellar stocked with preserved vegetables for winter. "And this was my mother's sewing room," Emma said, opening a door to a small room off the main parlor. Inside was a sewing machine, fabric neatly folded on shelves, and a rocking chair by the window. "Papa keeps it just like it was. Sometimes I come in here to remember her, but the memories are getting fuzzy now." Rebecca stepped into the room, feeling like an intruder in another woman's space. A sampler hung on the wall. "Home is where love grows." The neat stitches and cheerful colors seemed to mock Rebecca's current state. "Her name was Margaret," Emma said, running her hand over the sewing machine. "She taught me to sew a little before she got sick. Papa says I look like her, but I don't remember her face very well anymore." She looked up at Rebecca with solemn eyes. "Do you sew, Miss Winters?" Rebecca nodded. Her mother had insisted she learn all the domestic arts, though she had never particularly enjoyed them. "That's good," Emma said with satisfaction. "I need someone to teach me more. Papa tried, but he stuck himself with the needle so many times he said some words I'm not supposed to repeat." Despite herself, Rebecca felt a small internal warmth at the image of the serious sheriff trying to thread a needle. It wasn't quite amusement. She wasn't sure she was capable of that anymore, but it was something. "It's past your bedtime, young lady," came Thomas's voice from the doorway. He had returned, looking tired but satisfied. "But Papa," Emma protested, "I'm showing Miss Winters everything." "And you can continue tomorrow," Thomas said firmly. "It's been a long day for everyone." After Emma had been sent upstairs to prepare for bed, Thomas turned to Rebecca. "I apologize for having to leave so suddenly. Small-town sheriffing isn't usually dangerous, but it does mean irregular hours." Rebecca nodded in understanding. "Would you like some tea before turning in?" Thomas offered. "I usually have a cup in the evening." Rebecca hesitated, then nodded again. She followed him to the kitchen, where he set water to boil and prepared 2 cups with tea leaves. "I want to thank you," he said as they waited for the water, "for your patience with Emma. She's enthusiastic. It's been just the 2 of us for so long. I think she's starved for female company." Rebecca listened, noting the genuine affection in his voice when he spoke of his daughter. "I know this arrangement is unconventional," Thomas continued, "but I want to be clear about my expectations. I'm looking for a partner, someone to help raise Emma and share the work of maintaining a home. I'm not expecting. That is, any more personal aspects of marriage would only happen if we both felt it was right." The water boiled, and Thomas poured it carefully into the cups. "What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that you have time, Miss Winters. Time to decide if this place, if Emma and I, are what you want." Rebecca accepted the cup he offered, wrapping her hands around its warmth. His consideration surprised her. The practical arrangement she had agreed to suddenly seemed more humane than she had expected. "I should mention," Thomas said, sitting across from her at the table, "that Pine Ridge is a small town. People will talk, make assumptions. If that becomes uncomfortable for you, we can come up with a story that you're a relative staying to help with Emma, perhaps." Rebecca shook her head. She had endured far worse gossip in Boston. Small-town speculation held no fear for her. "As you wish," Thomas said. "Just know the option is there if you need it." They drank their tea in companionable silence, the grandfather clock in the parlor ticking away the minutes. Through the window, Rebecca could see stars emerging in the vast Montana sky, more stars than she had ever seen in Boston. "Miss Winters," Thomas said finally, "I don't know what brought you to answer my advertisement. I don't know what made a clearly educated woman from Boston decide to travel to the Montana Territory to marry a stranger. And I don't need to know unless someday you want to tell me. But I want you to know that whatever it was, you're safe here." Rebecca looked at him sharply, wondering if her background had somehow been revealed. "It's in your eyes," Thomas explained. Gently, "I've been sheriff long enough to recognize when someone's running from something. I'm not asking what it is. I'm just telling you that you can stop running now if you want to." Rebecca felt something crack in her carefully maintained composure. Tears threatened, and she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry, not here, not now. Thomas seemed to sense her distress. He stood, taking their empty cups to the sink. "It's been a long day. Why don't you get some rest? Things often look different in the morning light." Rebecca nodded and rose to leave. At the kitchen door, she paused and turned back. She couldn't offer words of gratitude, couldn't manage even the smallest smile, but she hoped her eyes conveyed some of what she felt. In her room, Rebecca changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed. The house creaked and settled around her, sounds so different from the city noises she was accustomed to. From down the hall, she could hear Thomas's deep voice reading to Emma, though she couldn't make out the words. She took the small wooden box from her bag, holding it in her lap without opening it. Inside were reminders of everything she had lost: a pressed flower from her first dance with James, a letter from her father congratulating her on her engagement, a newspaper clipping announcing the betrothal of Miss Rebecca Winters to Mr. James Harrington, one of Boston's most promising young businessmen. All lies. Every smile, every tender word, every promise, all part of an elaborate scheme to gain access to her father's business connections. James had never loved her. She had been merely a means to an end, a useful tool in his confidence game. The knowledge had nearly destroyed her. But sitting here in this quiet room, with the voices of Thomas and Emma drifting through the walls, Rebecca wondered if perhaps she had given James Harrington too much power. By allowing his betrayal to steal her joy, her ability to smile, to trust, to connect, wasn't she letting him win? The thought was uncomfortable, challenging. She pushed it away, returning the box to her bag unopened. She wasn't ready to face those memories, not yet. Tonight, she would sleep in this strange bed in this strange house, and tomorrow she would begin whatever this new life was to be. As she drifted toward sleep, Rebecca found herself thinking of Thomas's words. "You can stop running now if you want to." Was it possible? Could Pine Ridge be not just a hiding place, but a true home? It seemed an impossible hope, but for the first time in months, Rebecca allowed herself to consider the possibility. Outside her window, the Montana night spread vast and star-filled, indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow comforting in its vastness. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, but for now, in this moment, Rebecca Winters felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time, fragile sense of peace. Rebecca woke to the sound of unfamiliar birdsong. For a moment, she lay disoriented in the strange bed, morning light streaming through curtains she didn't recognize. Then memory returned. Montana, Sheriff Calloway, Emma, her new life. She dressed quickly in her second dress, a gray cotton that had seen better days but was clean and serviceable. Her hair she pinned in her usual severe style, not bothering with the small mirror on the dresser. What was the point of looking at a face that couldn't smile? Downstairs, she found Emma alone in the kitchen, carefully measuring coffee grounds into a pot. "Good morning, Miss Winters," Emma said brightly. "Papa had to go into town early, something about Mr. Peterson's horses getting loose, but he left breakfast for us. I'm making coffee because Papa says a day without coffee is like a sky without stars." Rebecca nodded in greeting, taking in the neat kitchen. Biscuits sat warming on the back of the stove, and a pan of scrambled eggs waited beside them. "I can serve you," Emma offered. "Papa says I'm getting good at being a proper hostess." Rebecca shook her head and gestured that she could serve herself. She wasn't an invalid after all, just a woman who couldn't smile. Over breakfast, Emma chattered about her plans for the day school in the morning, then helping Mrs. Peterson at the mercantile in the afternoon. "Papa says you might want to rest today after your journey, but if you'd like to come to town later, I could show you around. Pine Ridge isn't very big, but we have some nice people." Rebecca considered the offer. Part of her wanted to hide in this house, to postpone the inevitable scrutiny of the townsfolk, but she would have to face them eventually. Better to get it over with. She nodded. "Wonderful," Emma exclaimed. "I'll meet you at the mercantile at 4 o'clock. It's the big building with the green door. You can't miss it." After Emma left for school, Rebecca explored the house more thoroughly. It was well built and spacious by frontier standards, with 4 bedrooms upstairs and comfortable living areas below. Everything was clean and orderly, if somewhat plain. Thomas Calloway clearly took pride in his home. In his study, she found bookshelves filled with volumes that surprised her, not just practical manuals and law books, but poetry, history, novels by Dickens and Twain, even some Shakespeare. She ran her fingers along the spines, remembering how she had once loved to read, before everything in her life became colored by betrayal. A small desk held neatly organized papers, what appeared to be town records, wanted posters, and correspondence. Rebecca didn't pry, but she noted the methodical handwriting on the visible documents. Sheriff Calloway was a man who valued order. Next, she explored the kitchen, opening cupboards and drawers to familiarize herself with their contents. The pantry was well stocked with basic provisions: flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, preserves. If she was to stay, she would need to learn to cook frontier style, quite different from the formal meals she had been raised with in Boston. The back door opened onto a small vegetable garden, somewhat overgrown, but still productive. Late tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, and squash sprawled across one corner. A chicken coop stood nearby, where half a dozen hens scratched and clucked. Rebecca stood in the autumn sunshine, absorbing the peaceful scene. The mountains rose behind the house, their peaks already dusted with early snow. The air smelled of pine and earth and approaching winter. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that made Boston seem artificial by comparison. A movement caught her eye, a gray-striped cat slinking along the garden fence, eyeing the chicken speculatively. "That must be Whiskers," she murmured, her voice rough and disuse. The cat turned at the sound, fixing her with yellow eyes that seemed to evaluate her worth. Apparently finding her acceptable, it abandoned its chicken watching to approach, tail held high in greeting. Rebecca knelt, extending her hand. The cat sniffed her fingers, then butted its head against her palm, demanding attention. She stroked its soft fur, feeling the rumble of its purr against her fingers. "At least you don't care if I smile," she told the cat quietly. For the rest of the morning, Rebecca busied herself with domestic tasks. She swept floors, dusted shelves, and gathered eggs from the chicken coop. The physical activity felt good after days of sitting during her journey, and the simple chores gave her a sense of purpose. Around noon, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Through the kitchen window, she saw Thomas Calloway riding into the yard on a tall black horse. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man accustomed to horses and led the animal toward the barn. Rebecca quickly put on water for coffee, assuming he would want some upon his return to the house. She was cutting slices from a loaf of bread when he entered through the back door. "Miss Winters," he said, removing his hat, "you didn't need to prepare lunch. You're our guest." Rebecca gave a small shrug, indicating it was no trouble. "Thank you then," Thomas said. "It's appreciated." They ate a simple meal of bread, cheese, and apples, with hot coffee to wash it down. Thomas seemed content with silence, not pressing her for conversation, as some might have done. He ate with the efficiency of a man who viewed food as necessary fuel, rather than something to be lingered over. "I spoke with Reverend Mills this morning," he said as they finished. "Sunday services are at 10 if you'd care to attend. No obligation, of course, but it might be a good way to meet some of the townspeople." Rebecca nodded. Church had once been important to her, though her faith had been severely tested by recent events. "Emma mentioned she invited you to town this afternoon," Thomas continued. "Deputy Evans will be on duty, so I thought I might accompany you both, if that's acceptable. There are some people I'd like you to meet." Again, Rebecca nodded. His consideration in asking rather than simply informing her of the plan was noteworthy. "I should warn you," Thomas said, his expression turning serious. "Pine Ridge is a small town. People will be curious about you. Some may ask questions that seem intrusive. You don't owe anyone your story, Miss Winters. If anyone makes you uncomfortable, just let me know." Rebecca was touched by his protectiveness. In Boston, after the scandal, no one had shielded her from painful questions or accusations. As promised, Thomas accompanied Rebecca to town that afternoon. They rode in the wagon, with Thomas pointing out features of the landscape along the way. The creek that provided the town's water, the stand of aspens that turned bright gold in autumn, the old trapper's cabin that was the first structure built in the valley. Pine Ridge looked different in daylight. Rebecca could now see that despite its small size, the town was growing new construction at the north end. A schoolhouse that looked recently painted, hitching posts crowded with horses. It had the bustling energy of a place with a future. At the Mercantile, Emma was sweeping the front porch. Her face lit up when she saw them. "Miss Winters, Papa, you're both here." She set aside her broom and hurried to meet them. "Mrs. Peterson just made fresh cookies, and she said I could have two if I finished sweeping." "Then you'd better finish your task," Thomas said with gentle firmness. "Yes, sir," Emma said, returning to her sweeping with renewed vigor. Thomas helped Rebecca down from the wagon. "The Mercantile is the heart of any frontier town," he explained. "Mrs. Peterson knows everyone and everything that happens in Pine Ridge." Inside, the store was a wonder of frontier commerce shelves stocked with everything from nails to fabric, barrels of flour and sugar, glass cases displaying items too valuable to be handled casually. The air smelled of coffee beans, leather, and spices. Behind the counter stood a plump woman in her 50s, her gray hair neatly pinned beneath a lace cap. She looked up as they entered, her shrewd eyes taking in Rebecca's appearance with undisguised interest. "Sheriff Calloway," she greeted, "and this must be Miss Winters from Boston." Mrs. Peterson, Thomas nodded. Yes, this is Miss Rebecca Winters. Miss Winters, Mrs. Helen Peterson, owner of our finest and only mercantile. Welcome to Pine Ridge, my dear, Mrs. Peterson said warmly. We've been hearing about you for weeks. The sheriff has been quite mysterious about his mail order. Bride. Thomas cleared his throat uncomfortably. Miss Winters has just arrived yesterday, Mrs. Peterson. She's still getting settled. Of course, Mrs. Peterson said, though her curious gaze never left Rebecca's face. My, you're a pretty one, aren't you? Even with such a serious expression. Boston must have fine ladies indeed. Rebecca nodded politely, though she wanted to shrink from the woman's scrutiny. Miss Winters doesn't speak much, Thomas said carefully. She prefers to listen. Mrs. Peterson's eyebrows rose, but she recovered quickly. Well, that's refreshing. Most newcomers chatter on about how different everything is from back east, as if we don't know our town is small compared to their grand cities. Rebecca felt a flash of gratitude toward Thomas for his diplomatic explanation of her silence. He hadn't lied, exactly, but he'd phrased it in a way that preserved her dignity. Miss Winters needs some supplies, Thomas said, changing the subject. Winter clothing suitable for Montana, for one thing. Perhaps you could show her what's available while I check in at the office. Certainly, Sheriff, Mrs. Peterson said. Eagerly, I'll take good care of her. After Thomas left, Mrs. Peterson's professional demeanor softened slightly. Now, my dear, let's find you some proper clothes. That dress might have been fine for Boston, but you'll freeze come November. If that's all you have. Over the next hour, Rebecca was measured, draped, and outfitted with practical frontier clothing, flannel petticoats, woolen stockings, a heavy shawl, and sturdy boots. Mrs. Peterson kept up a running commentary on each item, the weather it was suited for, and which local women favored which styles. Mrs. Williams swears by these flannel-lined gloves for feeding livestock in winter, she explained, holding up a pair. Says her fingers never get frostbite, even in February. Rebecca selected items with nods or shakes of her head, writing down quantities when necessary on a pad Mrs. Peterson provided. She was conscious of the cost, mentally calculating as each item was added. Her funds were limited. What little she had salvaged from the Boston disaster wouldn't last long. As if reading her thoughts, Mrs. Peterson said quietly, "The sheriff opened an account for you, Miss Winters. He was quite specific that you should have whatever you need, no matter the cost." Rebecca looked up, surprised. Thomas hadn't mentioned this arrangement. "He's a good man, our sheriff," Mrs. Peterson continued, her voice dropping further. "After Margaret died, we all worried about him and little Emma. 4 years is a long time to be alone, especially when you have a child to raise. The whole town was relieved when he finally decided to seek a wife." Rebecca nodded, wondering what the woman was really trying to tell her. There were local ladies who had hopes in that direction. "Of course," Mrs. Peterson added, selecting a bolt of warm blue fabric. "Catherine Miller, the schoolteacher, for one. But the sheriff is a particular man, knows his own mind." So there had been other women interested in Thomas Calloway. Rebecca wasn't surprised. He was respected, established, reasonably handsome. A good catch in the territory where men outnumbered women significantly. "This blue would suit you," Mrs. Peterson said, returning to business. "Brings out the amber in your eyes. I can have Jim Turner cut the pattern for you. He's our closest thing to a tailor, or if you sew." Rebecca nodded to indicate she could sew. "Excellent. I'll include extra for a winter coat then. You'll need one by October, mark my words." As Mrs. Peterson wrapped her purchases, the door opened and a tall, elegantly dressed woman entered. Her blonde hair was arranged in an elaborate style that seemed out of place in the frontier town, and her green traveling dress was clearly expensive, if somewhat dusty from the road. "Sheriff Calloway," she called, not seeing Rebecca behind the counter. "I was hoping to find you here." "Miss Lancaster," Mrs. Peterson said, her tone cooling noticeably. "The sheriff is at his office. This is Miss Winters, recently arrived. From Boston." The blonde woman turned, her smile faltering slightly as she took in Rebecca. "Miss Winters? Oh, you must be the mail-order bride we've heard about." Rebecca nodded, immediately disliking the woman's condescending tone. "How quaint," Miss Lancaster said, removing her gloves. "I'm Victoria Lancaster. My father owns the Silver Creek mine north of town. We're practically neighbors to the Calloway property." "Miss Lancaster has been visiting her aunt in Denver," Mrs. Peterson explained to Rebecca. "She only returned last week." "Yes, Denver was absolutely civilized compared to our little settlement," Victoria said with a dismissive wave. "Though, I suppose compared to Boston, even Denver must seem provincial." Rebecca merely looked at the woman, her face expressionless. "Miss Winters is a woman of few words," Mrs. Peterson said, a hint of satisfaction in her voice. "Is she?" Victoria raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "How unusual. Sheriff Calloway has always struck me as a man who values good conversation." The implications were clear. Rebecca was somehow deficient, unsuitable for a man like Thomas. Calloway. It was exactly the kind of subtle cruelty Rebecca had faced in Boston after the scandal, though for different reasons. "Miss Winters may not speak much," came Emma's voice from the doorway, "but she's teaching me to read better, and she knows how to make whiskers purr, which even Papa can't do." Emma entered the store, having finished her sweeping. She moved to stand beside Rebecca, her small presence somehow strengthening. "Emma, darling," Victoria said, her voice honeyed. "How lovely to see you. I brought you a present from Denver, a porcelain doll with the most beautiful dress." "Thank you, Miss Lancaster," Emma said politely, though she didn't move away from Rebecca. "That's very kind." "I was just telling Miss Winters about your father's property," Victoria continued. "Such potential there, don't you think? With the right improvements, it could be one of the finest homes in the territory." "Papa says it's already the finest because we're in it," Emma replied, and Rebecca felt a surge of affection for the child's loyalty. Victoria's smile tightened. "Children say the sweetest things. Speaking of your father, I should go find him. I have some business matters to discuss." She turned back to Rebecca. "Miss Winters, welcome to Pine Ridge. I do hope you find our little community adequate after Boston." After she left, Mrs. Peterson made a sound suspiciously like a snort. That woman, putting on airs because her father struck silver. As if the rest of us have forgotten, she was born in a mining camp with dirt floors. "Papa says we shouldn't speak ill of others," Emma said solemnly, though her eyes danced with mischief. "Even if they wear too much perfume and talk like they have marbles in their mouth." Mrs. Peterson burst into laughter. "Your papa is right. Of course. Now let me wrap these packages for Miss Winters." Outside the mercantile, they found Thomas deep in conversation with Victoria Lancaster. The woman had her hand on his arm and was speaking intently, her face tilted up toward his. Rebecca felt an unexpected twinge of something, not quite jealousy. She had no claim on Thomas Calloway, but something protective, territorial. "Papa," Emma called, running to him. "Miss Winters got new winter clothes, and Mrs. Peterson says she's going to sew her own Kogan. Isn't that clever?" Thomas looked up, his expression lightening at the sight of his daughter. "Very clever," he agreed, gently disengaging from Victoria's grip. "Miss Winters, I hope you found everything you needed?" Rebecca nodded, conscious of Victoria's assessing gaze. "Sheriff, we hadn't finished our discussion," Victoria said, a note of petulance in her voice. "Perhaps another time, Miss Lancaster." Thomas said firmly, "I promised to show Miss Winters the town, and we still have several stops to make." Victoria's perfect features arranged themselves into a pout. "Very well. But do think about what I said about the town council position. Your voice would be so valuable." "I'll consider it," Thomas said neutrally. "Ladies, shall we continue our tour?" As they walked along Pine Ridge's main street, Emma between them, Rebecca found herself wondering about Victoria Lancaster. The woman clearly had designs on Thomas Calloway. That much was obvious even to Rebecca's socially rusty perception. Had there been something between them before? Was Victoria a rejected suitor, or had Thomas simply never noticed her interest? Their next stop was the schoolhouse, a neat white building at the end of the main street. School had finished for the day, but the teacher was still there, erasing chalk from the blackboard. "Miss Miller," Thomas called, "I'd like you to meet Miss Winters." Catherine Miller was a woman of about 30, with chestnut hair and intelligent blue eyes. She wore a simple brown dress with a white collar, practical but flattering. "Miss Winters," she said warmly, extending her hand. "Welcome to Pine Ridge. Emma has been telling us all about you." Rebecca shook the woman's hand, noting her firm grip and direct gaze. This was a woman comfortable in her own skin. "Miss Miller is our schoolteacher," Thomas explained. "She teaches all ages, from primer to advanced arithmetic. It's a challenge." "Sometimes," Miss Miller admitted with a smile, "but rewarding. Emma is one of my brightest pupils." Emma beamed at the praise. "Miss Miller lets me help the younger children with their letters," she told Rebecca proudly. "I understand you were a teacher's daughter, Miss Winters?" Miss Miller asked. Rebecca nodded, surprised that Thomas had shared even this small detail about her. "Perhaps you might consider helping at the school sometimes," Miss Miller suggested. "We're always short of hands, especially when the older children need more advanced instruction." The offer surprised Rebecca. She hadn't considered working in Pine Ridge, hadn't thought beyond the immediate arrangement with Thomas. But the idea of teaching, of having a purpose beyond domestic duties, was appealing. "Miss Winters is still settling in," Thomas said, "but I'm sure she'll consider your offer when she's ready." Their final stop was the sheriff's office, a solid building next to the small jailhouse. Inside, Deputy Evans was at the desk, writing in a logbook. "Afternoon, Sheriff," he said, standing as they entered. "Miss Winters, Emma. Nice to see you again. Anything to report, Deputy?" Thomas asked, removing his hat. "All quiet, sir. Received a telegram from the marshal in Helena about that bank robbery last month. They caught the Simmons brothers crossing into Canada. Good news," Thomas said with satisfaction. "Miss Winters, this is the heart of law enforcement in Pine Ridge. Not very grand, but it serves our needs." Rebecca looked around the simple office. A desk, a few chairs, a gun cabinet, wanted posters on the walls. A pot-bellied stove in the corner for winter warmth. It was neat and orderly, like everything associated with Thomas Calloway. "Miss Winters is from Boston," Deputy Evans told Thomas. "My cousin worked for the police department there for a while. Said it was a different world from frontier law, more rules, more paperwork." Thomas looked at Rebecca with interest. "Is that so? Boston must have quite a different approach to maintaining order." Rebecca nodded, grateful that the deputy hadn't mentioned anything about Boston's recent scandals. The Harrington case had been notorious enough that news might have reached even Montana territory. "Well, our methods here are simpler," Thomas said. "Know your people, be fair but firm, and hope common sense prevails more often than not. And when it doesn't," Deputy Evans added with a grin, "that's what the jailhouse is for." Rebecca found herself warming to the young deputy. His friendly manner and obvious respect for Thomas spoke well of him. Miss Miller mentioned the harvest festival next week, Deputy Evans said as they prepared to leave. "Will you be attending, Miss Winters?" "The whole town turns out for it." Rebecca looked to Thomas, uncertain. "We'll all be there," Thomas confirmed. "It's a Pine Ridge tradition: food, music, dancing. A way to celebrate before winter sets in." The thought of a public gathering, being the center of attention as the sheriff's mail-order bride, made Rebecca's stomach tightened with anxiety. But she could hardly hide away forever if she was going to build a life here. As they walked back to the wagon, Rebecca noticed several townspeople watching them curiously. A few nodded greetings, which she returned with slight inclinations of her head. Everyone seemed to be assessing her, measuring her against some unknown standard. Was she what they expected for their sheriff? Did they find her lacking, with her solemn face and silent ways? Did they wonder, as she did, whether she could ever be what Thomas and Emma needed? The ride home was quiet, Emma having exhausted her store of chatter for the day. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley, turning the mountains to gold and purple against the darkening sky. Rebecca found herself stealing glances at Thomas as he drove. His profile was strong, his expression thoughtful as he guided the horses along the rutted road. There was a steadiness to him that she found reassuring, a quality she had once thought she saw in James Harrington, before the mask fell away. But Thomas Calloway was nothing like James. Where James had been all smooth charm and practiced wit, Thomas was straightforward, even a bit rough around the edges. James had dazzled, Thomas simply was. Back at the house, Thomas insisted on carrying Rebecca's packages upstairs while Emma set the table for supper. Left alone in her room, Rebecca unpacked her new clothing, running her fingers over the warm fabrics. These practical garments were a world away from the fashionable dresses she had worn in Boston, but they represented something important, the beginnings of adaptation, of building a new life. From downstairs came the sounds of Thomas and Emma, moving about the kitchen, their voices a comfortable murmur through the floorboards. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening. Rebecca wondered if such ordinary moments could ever truly belong to her again, or if she would always feel like an outsider looking in, unable to fully participate because something vital in her had broken. She touched her face, feeling the stiff muscles around her mouth that had forgotten how to form a smile. How did one relearn joy after betrayal? How did one trust after such profound deception? As she changed for supper, replacing her travel-worn dress with a clean gray one, Rebecca caught sight of herself in the small mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger, thin-faced, solemn-eyed, remote. When had she become this person? And more importantly, was this who she wanted to remain? For the first time since the disaster in Boston, Rebecca considered the possibility that she had a choice. That perhaps, just perhaps, she could become someone new here in this wild, beautiful place. Not by forgetting what had happened, but by refusing to let it define her forever. It was a fragile, tentative thought, like the first green shoot after a forest fire. But it was there, and as Rebecca pinned her hair and prepared to join Thomas and Emma for supper, she carefully protected that small spark of possibility. The week passed in a rhythm that was both strange and comforting to Rebecca. Each day had its patterned breakfast with Thomas and Emma, seeing Emma off to school, household tasks, preparing meals, evening reading by the fire, simple activities that slowly began to feel like a life rather than an exile. She found herself settling into the Calloway household with surprising ease. Thomas was often busy with his duties as sheriff, but when home, he was a considerate companion, neither demanding conversation nor seeming troubled by its absence. Emma was a bright presence, filling silences with her chatter, but also seeming to understand when Rebecca needed quiet. Rebecca took over much of the cooking, discovering that while Thomas was competent in the kitchen, he welcomed her more skilled touch. She found unexpected satisfaction in preparing meals that brought appreciative nods from Thomas and enthusiastic praise from Emma. "These biscuits are even better than Mrs. Peterson's," Emma declared one morning, reaching for a second helping, and she won the county fair baking contest 3 years running. Thomas merely smiled at his daughter's exuberance, but the warmth in his eyes when he looked at Rebecca conveyed his own appreciation more eloquently than words. As promised, Rebecca attended church that Sunday. The small white building was filled to capacity with families dressed in their Sunday best. Rebecca wore her gray dress, freshly pressed, and a borrowed shawl from Emma's mother. She felt painfully conspicuous as she walked down the aisle beside Thomas and Emma, aware of the curious glances and whispered comments that followed them. Reverend Mills, a kind-faced man with silver hair, greeted them at the door. "Sheriff Calloway, Emma, and this must be Miss Winters. Welcome to our congregation, my dear." Rebecca nodded her thanks, relieved when Thomas guided her to a pew near the back. The familiar rhythms of the service, hymns, prayers, scripture readings, washed over her, comforting in their familiarity, even as the content sometimes stung. Reverend Mills preached on forgiveness, on letting go of past hurts to embrace God's future. Rebecca wondered if Thomas had told him something of her situation, or if the topic was simply divine coincidence. After the service, there was a social hour with coffee and cake in the church hall. Rebecca braced herself for the inevitable introductions and questions. "Miss Winters," said an elderly woman, approaching with the aid of a cane, "I'm Ruth Anderson. My husband was the previous sheriff before Thomas took over. Welcome to Pine Ridge." Rebecca nodded her greeting. "Thomas tells me you're a woman." "A few words," Mrs. Anderson continued, her shrewd eyes kind. "That's refreshing in a town where most people talk just to hear themselves." "My Walter was the same way," said more with a look than most men say in an hour of jawing. Rebecca found herself warming to the old woman's directness. Throughout the social hour, Thomas stayed close, smoothly intervening when questions became too personal or expectations of response too pointed. Rebecca noticed Victoria Lancaster holding court across the room, surrounded by admiring men but frequently glancing their way with poorly disguised interest. "Don't mind Victoria," Mrs. Anderson said, following Rebecca's gaze. "She's always had her eye on Thomas, ever since her father struck silver, and she decided she needed a husband with status to match her new wealth." Rebecca raised an eyebrow, curious despite herself. "Thomas never encouraged her," Mrs. Anderson continued in a low voice. "He's too honorable for that. But Victoria doesn't give up easily when she wants something, and she's used to getting her way." The warning was clear, and Rebecca filed it away. Not that she had any romantic claim on Thomas Calloway. Their arrangement was practical, not passionate, but it was useful to understand the dynamics at play. The following days settled into a routine. Rebecca continued to help around the house, and gradually began venturing beyond its walls. She gathered late vegetables from the garden, fed the chickens, and even learned to milk the cow under Emma's enthusiastic, but not entirely accurate instruction. "Pull harder no, gentler no, more like you're ringing a bell but very slowly," Emma directed, until Rebecca shooed her away to figure it out herself. On Tuesday, Rebecca walked Emma to school, then continued on to Miss Miller's house with a basket of late tomatoes from the garden. Thomas had suggested the gesture as a way of thanking the teacher for her welcome. Catherine Miller lived in a small but charming cottage near the schoolhouse. She seemed genuinely pleased by Rebecca's visit, inviting her in for tea despite the early hour. "I'm so glad you came," Catherine said as she put the kettle on. "Most days my only conversation is with children under 12. She chatted easily, not seeming to mind Rebecca's silence, sharing stories about the school and town that were both amusing and informative. Rebecca found herself relaxing in the teacher's company. "You know," Catherine said as they finished, their tea, "my offer about helping at the school was genuine. The older children are preparing for a history exhibition, and I could use someone with knowledge of the wider world." Rebecca hesitated. The idea was appealing. She had always enjoyed learning and had sometimes helped in her father's classroom in Boston. But the thought of standing before a group, being expected to speak, filled her with anxiety. Catherine seemed to sense her concern. "You wouldn't need to lecture. Just help the children with their research, guide their reading. Your presence would be valuable even without many words." Put that way, it seemed possible. Rebecca nodded slowly. "Wonderful." Catherine beamed. "Can you come tomorrow morning? We're studying the early settlements of the territory something." I'm sure looks quite different from a Boston perspective. The next day, Rebecca arrived at the schoolhouse with trepidation. The one-room school held about 20 students, ranging from 6 to 16 years old. They stared at her with undisguised curiosity as Catherine introduced her. "Miss Winters will be helping our older students with their history projects," Catherine explained. "She comes to us from Boston and has a wonderful education that she's generously sharing with us." The youngest children quickly returned to their spelling exercises, but the 5 oldest students, 3 boys and 2 girls between 13 and 16, continued to study. Rebecca with interest as she joined them at their table. "Miss Winters," Catherine said, "perhaps you could review what the students have written so far and offer suggestions." Rebecca nodded and accepted the stack of papers the students somewhat reluctantly handed over. Their projects were earnest if simplistic accounts of westward expansion, heavy on adventure and light on the complexities of settlement. She read through them carefully, making notes in the margin, suggestions for additional research, gentle corrections of factual errors, questions to encourage deeper thinking. The students watched warily at first, then with growing interest as they saw her notes. "You really think the Native American perspective should be included?" asked James, the oldest boy, looking at her comment on his paper. Rebecca nodded firmly. She picked up her pencil and wrote on a blank sheet. "History is always more complex than it first appears. Every story has multiple sides." "That's exactly right," Catherine said, reading over Rebecca's shoulder. "And that's why Miss Winters' help is so valuable. She brings a different perspective." By the end of the morning, the students were competing for Rebecca's attention, showing her maps they'd drawn and asking questions about Boston. Rebecca answered in writing when necessary, but found that much could be communicated through gestures, nods, and expressions. As she walked home for lunch, Rebecca felt a warmth in her chest that had been absent for months. For a few hours, she had been more than her trauma, more than the woman who couldn't smile. She had been useful, valued for her mind rather than judged for her silence. That evening, as they sat by the fire after Emma had gone to bed, Rebecca impulsively took a piece of paper from Thomas's desk and wrote, "Thank you for suggesting I visit Catherine Miller. I've agreed to help at the school 2 mornings a week." Thomas read the note, his eyes lifting to meet hers with genuine pleasure. "I'm glad," he said simply. "Catherine is a good woman, and teaching seems to suit you." Rebecca hadn't expected how much his approval would mean to her. She ducked her head, feeling a warmth in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. The days leading up to the Harvest Festival were busy with preparations. The entire town was involved, from the smallest children gathering autumn leaves for decorations to the elders supervising the food preparations. As the sheriff's household, the Callaways were expected to participate fully. Rebecca found herself baking pies under Mrs. Peterson's exacting direction, sewing bunting with a group of women at the church, and helping Emma create paper lanterns for the evening celebration. "This is my favorite time of year," Emma confided as they worked. "Everything smells like cinnamon and apples, and Papa always dances with me at the festival." Rebecca glanced up, trying to imagine the serious sheriff. "Dancing, he does," Emma insisted, reading her doubt. "He says it's tradition, since I was big enough to stand on his boots. Maybe this year he'll dance with you too." The thought sent an unexpected flutter through Rebecca's chest. She hadn't danced since before the scandal in Boston, hadn't even considered it a possibility anymore. The day of the festival dawned clear and crisp, with the mountains sharp against a brilliant blue sky. Thomas was busy with final preparations in town, coordinating security for the event, while Rebecca helped Emma dress in her festival outfit, a blue dress with white trim that had been her mother's, carefully altered to fit her growing frame. "You look beautiful," Rebecca wrote on a scrap of paper, showing it to Emma as the girl twirled before the mirror. "So do you," Emma responded, though Rebecca was still in her everyday dress. "Are you going to wear your new blue fabric?" Mrs. Peterson said it matches your eyes. Rebecca shook her head. She had started work on a dress from the fabric, but it wasn't finished yet. She would wear her gray dress, freshly washed and pressed. But it's a celebration, Emma protested. Papa says celebrations call for special clothes. Rebecca hesitated, then went to the wardrobe. At the back, carefully wrapped in tissue paper, was the one fine dress she had salvaged from her Boston life. A gown of deep burgundy silk with a fitted bodice and modest bustle, styled for evening events rather than frontier festivities. She had brought it without any real expectation of wearing it again, unable to leave behind this last remnant of her former life. Emma gasped as Rebecca unwrapped it. It's the most beautiful dress I've ever seen. Like something from a fashion magazine. Rebecca held it up doubtfully. It was decidedly out of place in Pine Ridge, likely to draw even more attention than her usual somber attire. You have to wear it, Emma insisted. Please? Looking at the girl's eager face, Rebecca found she couldn't refuse. She nodded, and Emma squealed with delight. I'll help you with the buttons, she offered. And I can pin your hair up like the ladies in the illustrations Mrs. Peterson showed me. An hour later, Rebecca barely recognized herself in the small mirror. The burgundy silk, while more formal than the occasion called for, fit her perfectly, highlighting her slender figure and bringing warm color to her pale skin. Emma had arranged her hair in a simple but elegant style, with soft curls framing her face instead of the severe bun she usually wore. You look like a princess, Emma breathed. Wait until Papa sees you. Rebecca felt a moment of panic. What would Thomas think of this transformation? Would he see it as inappropriate, too reminiscent of the sophisticated Boston society that had rejected her? Before she could reconsider, they heard the wagon approaching. Thomas had returned to drive them to town for the festival. Emma, Rebecca, are you ready? He called from below. Coming, Papa. Emma shouted back. Wait until you see Miss Winters. Rebecca followed Emma down the stairs, suddenly self-conscious. Thomas stood in the entryway, dressed in his best clothes, a black suit with a crisp white shirt, his sheriff's star polished to a shine. He looked up as they descended, his expression changing from everyday friendliness to stunned appreciation. As he took in Rebecca's appearance, Miss Winters, he said, his voice lower than usual, you look remarkable. Emma giggled. Doesn't she look like a princess, Papa? I did her hair myself. You both look beautiful, Thomas said, recovering his composure. The bells of the Harvest Festival, without a doubt. The drive to town was filled with Emma's excited chatter, but Rebecca was acutely aware of Thomas beside her, of the sidelong glances he cast her way when he thought she wouldn't notice. Something had shifted between them, some barrier lowered. By this glimpse of the woman she had been before tragedy struck. Pine Ridge was transformed for the Harvest Festival. The main street was decorated with autumn leaves, pumpkins, and paper lanterns waiting to be lit at dusk. Tables laden with food lined one side of the street, while the other had been cleared for dancing. A small group of musicians was setting up near the church, a fiddler, a guitarist, and a man with a harmonica. As the sheriff's family arrived, a cheer went up from the gathered townspeople. Thomas was clearly well liked, and even Rebecca received warm greetings as he escorted her and Emma toward the center of the festivities. Sheriff Calloway. Mayor Wilson, a portly man with impressive side whiskers, approached with his wife. And Miss Winters, my dear, you are a vision. Boston's loss is certainly our gain. Rebecca nodded her thanks, though she noticed several women eyeing her dress with a mixture of admiration and resentment. She was suddenly aware that she might have made a mistake in wearing something so obviously expensive and Eastern. But it was too late to change now, and Emma was already pulling her toward the food tables, eager to show off the pies they had baked together. The festival was unlike any event Rebecca had attended in Boston. There, social gatherings had been carefully orchestrated affairs with rigid protocols and subtle hierarchies. Here, everyone mingled freely, miners and merchants, ranchers and shopkeepers, all sharing food and conversation with easy familiarity. As the sheriff, Thomas was in constant demand, pulled in different directions by people wanting to discuss everything from water rights to the new schoolhouse roof. Rebecca stayed close to Emma, helping the girl fill her plate with treats and listening to her identify each townsperson with unintentionally revealing descriptions. "That's Mr. Jenkins, who always smells like horses but gives the best candy at Christmas. And that's Mrs. Foster, who had twins last year and looks tired all the time now. And that's Mr. Thompson, who Papa had to lock up once for shooting at his neighbor's dog. But they're friends again now." Rebecca found herself relaxing. Despite the crowd, drawn into the genuine warmth of the community celebration. These people might be curious about her, might whisper about the sheriff's silent mail-order bride, but there was no malice in their interest, no cutting remarks or deliberate cruelty as there had been in Boston. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit along the street, casting a golden glow over the festivities. The musicians began to play in earnest, and couples moved into the cleared area for dancing. Thomas appeared at Rebecca's side, having temporarily escaped his mayoral duties. "Emma tells me I'm required to dance with both of you tonight," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's apparently a sacred tradition," Emma bounced excitedly. "First me, then Miss Winters, Papa." "As you command, Princess," Thomas said with mock solemnity, offering his hand to his daughter. Rebecca watched as Thomas led Emma onto the dance floor, lifting her occasionally as they moved through the simple steps of a country dance. The girl's face was alight with joy, and Thomas's usual serious expression had softened into unguarded affection. They were beautiful together, this father and daughter who had weathered loss and emerged with their capacity for happiness intact. "Unlike me," Rebecca thought, touching her face where smiles used to form. "They're wonderful, aren't they?" Came a voice beside her. Rebecca turned to find Catherine Miller watching the dancers with a warm expression. "Thomas is a good father," Catherine continued. "After Margaret died, he devoted himself entirely to Emma. Some of us worried he might never allow himself any personal happiness again." Rebecca glanced at the teacher, wondering if Catherine herself had harbored hopes in that direction. "Which is why we were all so pleased when he decided to seek a wife," Catherine added, meeting Rebecca's gaze directly. "Emma needs a mother, yes, but Thomas deserves companionship too. He's a man with a great capacity for love, when he allows himself to feel it." Before Rebecca could process this unexpected confidence, the dance ended and Thomas was leading. Emma backed toward them. "Your turn, Miss Winters," Emma announced. "Papa's a very good dancer, I promise." Thomas held out his hand, his expression a question. "Would you care to dance, Miss Winters?" "Only if you wish to, of course." Rebecca hesitated. Dancing meant closeness, connection, allowing herself to be led by a man's hands. After James's betrayal, she had sworn never to put herself in such a vulnerable position again. But this was Thomas Calloway, not James Harrington. Thomas, who had never pushed her to speak, who had respected her boundaries, who looked at her now with genuine concern for her comfort rather than expectation. Slowly, Rebecca placed her hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers, warm and strong, as he led her toward the dance floor. The musicians had begun a waltz, a simpler version of the elegant dances Rebecca had learned in Boston parlors. Thomas placed his hand respectfully at her waist, maintaining proper distance between them as they began to move to the music. "I should warn you," he said quietly. "I learned to dance from a retired cavalry officer who believed waltzing was best approached like a military campaign. I apologize in advance for any trampled toes." His self-deprecating humor eased some of Rebecca's tension. She found herself remembering the steps easily, her body recalling the patterns even as her mind had forgotten the pleasure of the dance. Thomas was actually quite graceful for a man of his size, guiding her smoothly through the other couples. As they danced, Rebecca became aware of curious glances from the townspeople, some approving, some speculative, some clearly envious. Victoria Lancaster stood at the edge of the dance floor, her perfect features arranged in a smile that didn't reach her eyes as she watched them pass. "I believe Miss Lancaster is hoping for the next dance," Rebecca wrote in the air with her finger, surprising herself with the small jest. Thomas's lips quirked. "Miss Lancaster will have to be disappointed then. I've promised all my dances to you and Emma this evening." The simple declaration shouldn't have affected her so strongly, but Rebecca felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with exertion. For this moment, moving in harmony with this good, honorable man under the harvest moon and paper lanterns, she could almost remember what happiness felt like. The dance ended too soon. Thomas led her back to where Emma waited, her eyes shining with approval. "You looked so beautiful together," the girl said, "like in a storybook." "Miss Winters makes any partner look good," Thomas said gallantly. "Now how about some cider before the next dance?" As Thomas went to fetch their drinks, Deputy Evans approached with an apologetic expression. "Sorry to interrupt your evening, Sheriff, but there's a situation at the Silver Mine Saloon that needs your attention. Miller and Davidson are about to come to blows over a card game." Thomas sighed. "Duty calls, I'm afraid. Will you ladies be all right for a short while? I shouldn't be long." "We'll be fine, Papa," Emma assured him. "Deputy Evans can keep us company. Can't you, Deputy?" "It would be my honor," the young man said with a grin. "Though I warn you, Miss Emma, I'm an even worse dancer than your father." As Thomas disappeared into the crowd, Rebecca found herself surrounded by well-meaning townspeople, all eager to meet the sheriff's mysterious bride now that he wasn't present to run interference. Mrs. Peterson took it upon herself to make proper introductions, smoothly explaining Rebecca's silence as a temporary condition following a difficult journey that didn't require further explanation. Rebecca was grateful for the woman's tact, though she noticed the curious glances and whispered speculations that followed her. She did her best to be gracious, nodding and gesturing when appropriate, allowing Emma to chatter for both of them. The evening grew cooler, and Rebecca was just considering whether to fetch her shawl from the wagon when a familiar voice cut through the nearby conversations. "Miss Winters, you're positively shivering. Here, take my wrap. Silk is lovely but hardly practical for our mountain evenings." Victoria Lancaster appeared beside her, draping a fine cashmere shawl around Rebecca's shoulders before she could refuse. The gesture appeared generous, but there was something calculated in Victoria's smile that put Rebecca on guard. "I've been hoping for a chance to speak with you privately," Victoria continued, linking her arm through Rebecca's and drawing her away from the others. "There's something you should know for your own benefit." Rebecca stiffened but allowed herself to be led a short distance from the main festivities, curious despite her distrust. Emma was happily engaged in a children's game nearby, supervised by Catherine Miller, and would be fine for a few minutes. When they were relatively isolated near the church steps, Victoria turned to face her. "I'm going to be direct, Miss Winters, because I believe in honesty. You seem like a decent woman, if rather damaged by whatever happened to you in Boston." Rebecca's spine straightened at the barely veiled insult, but Victoria continued before she could react. "Thomas Calloway is a good man, one of the finest in the territory. He deserves a wife who can be a true partner to him, someone who can support his ambitions, host political gatherings, speak on his behalf when necessary. Not someone who—" She gestured vaguely at Rebecca's face. "Who can't even manage." A simple smile. The words hit their mark with painful accuracy. Rebecca had thought the same thing herself many times over the past week. Thomas did deserve better than a broken woman who couldn't express joy, who carried the weight of scandal and failure with her like a shadow. "I've known Thomas for years." Victoria pressed her advantage. We have an understanding, a connection that predates your arrival. He only advertised for a mail-order bride because the town council pressured him, saying Emma needed a mother figure. But his heart, she placed a hand over her own chest dramatically, his heart has always been promised elsewhere. Rebecca studied the beautiful woman before her, trying to determine how much was truth and how much manipulation. Thomas had never mentioned any attachment to Victoria Lancaster, but then, personal matters weren't the subject of their limited conversations. "I'm telling you this for your own good," Victoria said, her voice softening to false sympathy. "Before you develop feelings that can only lead to heartbreak. Thomas is too honorable to send you away once you've arrived, but don't mistake his kindness for romantic interest." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Victoria's words echoed her deepest fears that she was an obligation to Thomas, a responsibility he had taken on out of duty rather than desire. That her broken, silent self could never be truly wanted, only tolerated. "There you are." Emma's voice cut through Rebecca's spiraling thoughts. The girl bounded up to them, her face flushed with excitement. "Papa's back, and they're going to start the square dancing. He's looking for you, Miss Winters." Victoria's perfect features arranged themselves into a smile. "We were just having a little girl talk, weren't we, Miss Winters? Getting to know each other better." Emma looked between them, her young face suddenly suspicious. "Papa says Miss Lancaster always has motives hidden like Easter eggs," she said bluntly. "What were you really talking about?" "Emma," Thomas's voice came from behind them, sharp with reproof. "That's not a polite thing to say to anyone." He approached quickly, his expression shifting from stern to concerned as he took in Rebecca's pale face and Victoria's satisfied smile. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his gaze fixed on Rebecca. Before she could respond, "Not that." She would have found words even if she could speak. Victoria stepped forward and placed her hand on Thomas's arm. "Thomas, darling, I was just telling Miss Winters about our history together. I thought she should know, given the circumstances." Thomas's face hardened, his jaw setting in a way Rebecca hadn't seen before. "History, Miss Lancaster? I wasn't aware we had one worth mentioning." Victoria's smile faltered slightly. "Thomas, there's no need for pretense. Miss Winters deserves to know the truth about your feelings." "My feelings?" Thomas's voice had dropped dangerously low. "Miss Lancaster, I've never given you any indication that my feelings extend beyond neighborly courtesy. If you've suggested otherwise to Miss Winters, then you've spoken falsely." Victoria's composure cracked, spots of color appearing high on her cheekbones. "You can't possibly be serious about this. This arrangement, she doesn't even speak, Thomas. What kind of wife could she possibly be to a man of your position?" Emma gasped at the cruelty of the words, but Thomas remained icily calm. "Miss Lancaster," he said quietly, "I would advise you to stop now, before you say something that cannot be taken back. Miss Winters is my guest and, I hope, my future wife. She deserves your respect, if not your friendship." Victoria looked from Thomas to Rebecca, her beautiful face twisting with anger and humiliation. "You'll regret this choice, Sheriff. When you need someone who can actually function in society, don't come looking for me." She turned on her heel and stalked away, leaving her expensive shawl still draped around Rebecca's shoulders. Emma proudly displayed her school books, explaining which subjects she found easy and which required more effort. "Reading and history are my favorites," she confided. "But arithmetic makes my head hurt sometimes, especially fractions." "Fractions can be tricky," Rebecca agreed. "But they make more sense when you think of them as parts of a pie. That's what Miss Miller says too. She brought in an apple pie once and cut it into different fractions to show us how they work." Emma looked at Rebecca hopefully. "Maybe you could bake a pie for our first day of school here?" Rebecca smiled at the transparent attempt to combine education with treats. "Perhaps. We'll see what supplies we have." They were still working when they heard a wagon approaching. Through the window, Rebecca saw Thomas returning, his expression weary but resolved. She sent Emma to wash up for the midday meal while she went to meet him. "How did it go?" she asked as he climbed down from the wagon. "About as well as could be expected," Thomas sighed, removing his hat. Victoria denied everything at first, then tried to blame it on too much wine at the festival. When presented with the evidence, she broke down and confessed. "What will happen to her?" Rebecca asked, genuinely concerned despite everything. Victoria's actions had been terrible, but they stemmed from pain and rejection, emotions Rebecca understood all too well. Her father has agreed to pay for the entire rebuilding of the schoolhouse, not just the timber, but all materials and labor, Thomas explained. And Victoria will be sent to her aunt in Denver for the foreseeable future. The town council decided against pressing criminal charges, given her father's importance to the local economy. "Is that justice?" Rebecca wondered aloud. Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture of frustration. "It's the best compromise I could negotiate. The school will be rebuilt better than before, and Victoria will be removed from a situation where she might cause more harm. Sometimes frontier justice has to be practical as well as principled." Rebecca nodded, understanding the difficult position he had been in. "You did what you could. That's all anyone can ask." Thomas looked at her with tired eyes that still managed to convey warmth. "You've changed since last night," he observed. "Not just the speaking and smiling, though. Those are wonderful. There's something else, a likeness to you." Rebecca considered his words. "I think," she said slowly, "that I finally let go of Boston, of the person I was trying to protect by staying silent." Thomas nodded encouragingly, waiting for her to continue. "When the schoolhouse was burning, when you ran inside," Rebecca's voice faltered at the memory of her terror, "I realized that fear of being hurt again was keeping me from truly living, from caring about people, from making a difference." She looked up at him, this man who had shown her what real strength looked like, not the showy confidence of a James Harrington, but the quiet courage of someone who did what was right even when it was difficult. "You asked me by the creek if friendship and partnership would be enough," she said softly. "The truth is, Thomas, I think I might be ready for more than that, if you're patient with me." Thomas's face transformed with hope. "Rebecca," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips, "I would wait forever if that's what you needed." He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his own. "When Margaret died, I thought that part of my life was over, that Emma would be my only family, my only love. Then you arrived with your quiet dignity and your wounded heart, and something inside me woke up again." Rebecca felt tears gathering in her eyes, but for once they weren't tears of pain or loss. "I came here running away from my past," she admitted. "I never expected to find a future." Thomas released one of her hands to gently touch her cheek. "May I kiss you, Rebecca Winters? Not as part of our arrangement, but as a man who finds himself falling in love with the remarkable woman before him." Rebecca's heart raced, but not with fear. With anticipation, with joy, with the thrill of beginning again. "Yes," she whispered, tilting her face up to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as they both leaned into the connection they had been building since her arrival. It wasn't the practiced seduction James had used, designed to impress and manipulate. It was honest, a little awkward, perfectly real. When they broke apart, Rebecca was smiling a full, genuine smile that transformed her face and reached her eyes. Thomas stared at her in wonder, his thumb tracing the curve of her lips. "There you are," he murmured. "I've been waiting to meet this Rebecca." From the doorway came a delighted squeal. "Papa, you're kissing Miss Winters." They turned to find Emma watching them, her eyes wide with excitement. "Does this mean you're going to be my mother for real?" she asked Rebecca directly. Not just because of letters and arrangements, But because you and Papa love each other? Rebecca looked at Thomas, seeing in his eyes the same hope and caution that filled her own heart. They had known each other such a short time, had only begun to explore these feelings. But sometimes, Rebecca realized, the heart knows what the mind is still figuring out. Sometimes courage means taking the leap of faith. "I think," she said carefully, kneeling to meet Emma at eye level, "that your father and I are discovering that we care for each other very much, and that I already care for you as if you were my own daughter." Emma's face lit up. "I knew it. I told Miss Miller that you and Papa looked at each other like people in love, even when you weren't talking, and she said sometimes the eyes say more than words ever could." Thomas laughed, the sound rich and full in the afternoon light. "Miss Miller is very wise," he said, joining Rebecca in kneeling before his daughter. "But Emma, these things take time. Miss Winters and I are just beginning to understand our feelings for each other. But you do love her?" Emma pressed, her young face serious. "Because she makes you smile more, Papa. And now she can smile too, so you match." Thomas met Rebecca's eyes over his daughter's head, a silent question in his gaze. Rebecca felt a moment of panic. It was too soon, too fast, but then a calm certainty settled over her. Some things didn't need years to know. Some connections were recognized by the soul long before the mind caught up. "Yes, Emma," she said softly, her eyes never leaving Thomas's. "I believe I do love your father. Even when I couldn't say it, couldn't show it, the feeling was growing." Thomas's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "And I love you, Rebecca Winters, with or without words, with or without smiles. But I must admit, the smiles are very nice." Emma threw her arms around both of them, creating a circle of embraces in the autumn sunlight. "This is the best day ever," she declared. "Our house is going to be a school. Miss Winters can talk and smile, and we're going to be a real family." Over Emma's head, Rebecca and Thomas shared a look of perfect understanding. There would be challenges ahead. Rebecca's past still held painful secrets she would need to share. The town would need to rebuild after the fire, and learning to be a family would require patience and work from all of them. But for now, in this moment, Rebecca felt a peace she had thought lost forever. The woman who had arrived in Pine Ridge, unable to smile, had found not just her facial expressions again, but her voice, her courage, and her heart. As Thomas leaned forward to kiss her forehead, his touch gentle and reverent, Rebecca knew with sudden clarity that this was what healing truly meant. Not erasing the past or forgetting the pain, but building something new and beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The Montana sky stretched endless and blue above the Calloway house, promising limitless possibilities for those brave enough to reach for them. Rebecca Winters, once broken by betrayal, had found the courage to smile again, and in that smile lay the promise of all the joy still to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.